Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary. Paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his closing name. Salvation has been brought down, oh glory. Praise the Lord, salvation has been.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of the Harvester Podcast. My name is Brian Kenyon, and with me are
Forrest Emissaries,
Stephen Ford.
And in this episode, or this season of our podcast, in this episode, we're dealing with cultural things that affect our culture or things that we see in our culture. And so we've talked about some things in the previous 3 episodes, particularly about Christian ethics and God versus God system of ethics. But today the title of this is Lies Disguised as Truths in Today's Culture. And when you read that title, you might think of, fornication, homosexuality, things like that. But these are really things that get behind, and to me, these are some of the things that are like the reason why, how have we gotten to the point where we think it's okay for a man to claim he's a woman, and then we have to abide by that and use the pronouns and all that. But how did we get to that point? And there's a lot of things involved with that. But I want to start out, and I was turned on to a book called Strange New World a couple of years ago, and some of this material is from that, but some of it is not, and so but it kind of gave me the idea of this. And so I want to start out with a quote from the Mad Hatter. We remember the Mad Hatter from
Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, Alice in Wonderland, and that's my favorite cartoon, Disney cartoon, even to this day. But anyway, he says, if I had a world of my own, everything would be nonsense. Nothing would be what it is, because everything would be what it isn't. And contrawise, what is, it wouldn't be. Now, that's very confusing when you think about that, but that's kind of where we are in our culture with some of these things. Now, we must be people who understand the times. I know in 1 Chronicles 12:32 and Esther 1:13, it mentions people who knew the times. And, of course, Matthew 10:16 says to be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. And so we want to look at some things in this episode here that has kind of shaped where we are today. And so we're going to look at 3 lies disguised as truths in today's culture. And we've already agreed that we might have to make this into 2 parts, but we'll let you know when the time comes. But anyway, the first one here is the status quo is oppressive. The status quo is oppressive. Now, a lot of these things come from Marxism, which we've seen a rise in that throughout human history. But even in our country over the last couple decades, maybe half a century or century maybe even, I don't know. But the status quo is oppressive. Basically how this comes out is get rid of everything traditional. Traditional authority, including the Bible, is nothing but a tool for those in power to remain in control. And haven't we seen this over the past couple of years or decades about trying to, there is no authority, whether it's Bible, whether it's parental, government, whatever. It's like everybody is allowed to do his own thing.
Yeah. And I think, I think part of this is this idea of we could never improve society by going back to something. Like, we always have to be going forward. Like, things always have to be changing. There always has to be progress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that stands in direct contrast to, what Jeremiah says, seek the old paths, where, sure, history is not perfect. There's people who sinned and made mistakes, and there's been oppression throughout history. But this idea of there is a way to go forward by going back. And some of this traditional stuff is traditional stuff for a reason, because it works and it's good. One man, one woman in a household, married, having kids, like that works for society. It works for people. It works, and it's what God commanded. So, the status quo is, I guess it depends on what you mean by status quo. But if you're always looking to change things, unsettle things, overturn things, burn things down, scrap things, start over. It's just going to be, some of the chaos that we see around us right now. Mm-hmm. And you're never going to get that, especially us, our goal is to restore New Testament Christianity, restore the Christianity we can read about in the Bible. You're going to have to go back to some things. You can't just, go quote unquote forward. Not all progress is progress, I think you could say,
And there's ways to maintain tradition with still having some modernity in there. So by that, I mean to say, evangelism right now, we don't all get on horseback and travel to places. We use newer mediums. People don't use the newspaper anymore to evangelize now. We may use digital forms. People are on TikTok. There have been, conversions by way of TikTok. But, the ancient part of it, traditional part is we're still evangelizing. And there are some things that just don't need to be changed. If you want to lose weight, you don't say, hey, let's try something new. Let's try to eat Doritos and Twinkies every day.
Right.
It's like, no, we still need to diet or exercise because that still works. Now, you may exercise in a different way at a different gym, using different equipment or whatever, newer vitamins or whatever. But the traditional thing is it's going to be diet and exercise.
Yeah.
That's just it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, all of us have probably known people that it seems like whatever's traditional, they want to change.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Even the good stuff, whatever traditional they want to change. And this is where, like, the Marxism comes in with the status quo when Forrest, asks the rhetorical question, what is the status quo? Depends on how you define it. Mm-hmm. And so, in Marxism, it worked out pretty much with land ownership is how that all got started. That, the common people couldn't own land and all this kind of stuff. And so how, the status quo was oppressive. Mm-hmm. And so it has to begin, you have to have a revolution in order to tear down so it can be rebuilt. They call that deconstruction and then reconstruction, so that when you rebuild, you leave out all the stuff that was oppressive and all of that. But when you think about in the history of even America, maybe the, feminist movement and things like that, it was all based upon deconstruct it, and we'll get into critical race theory later on in this season, and so we'll talk about it then there too. But it's like, everything has to be taken down, but rather with building up, taking out the bad stuff, putting in good stuff. It's got to be a whole different system, because that status quo is oppressive, and we've got to get out from under it. And so to convince people that's oppressive, you have to have all these speeches and all this kind of stuff to tell you it's oppressive. And then, the rioting and all that, when you think about in Europe, Marxism has worked because, the riots and stuff will come along and they'll tear down the system and build new systems. But in America, it hasn't worked yet but when you see all this rioting, like with the George Floyd thing and all the stuff that they were allowed to go because the status quo is oppressive, and you got to destroy the status quo. And then, of course, with the new administration in now, it's a little bit different, but it's like it's still, and when I say it's a little bit different, it's like they're not allowing people to riot now, whereas before they would. Now, why would they allow so many people to riot and tear stuff up without any accountability? Even our former vice president offered to pay the bail for some of these people because all in their mind, the status quo, the present America is oppressive, so we've got to do away with it. And but it all comes from this idea the status quo is oppressive, and that's the lie that's in disguise. But as we know, the gospel, can be lived in any culture. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be democracy. It can be a monarchy. It can be even a socialist. There'll be persecution and all that, but the gospel kind of transcends any culture.
Right. Well, and part of the problem is, this idea of getting rid of the status quo, Christianity is lumped in there with the status quo and Christian principles. I just gave the example of, a husband and a wife and their household together with children. But even that, the problem is people want to build a society better than the one we have now without the things that make society good, right? Yes. So we're going to have a society but without a traditional family. We're going to have a society but without Christianity. We're going to have a society but without religion. We're going to, and then that's not, but you can't make a society that way, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't have males and females that are procreating, that's literally the end of society. Eventually it ends. So this idea of getting rid of everything traditional kind of is like, obviously, you're going to run into some problems. But the irony to me is when you get rid of the status quo, all you do is build another status quo.
Right.
And then in 30 years, that is oppressive. And then you have to, so it's just like this never ending destroy and restart. But we need something eternal. We need something everlasting. We need something that's always going to work, always going to be good, always going to create what we need. And that, of course, is the gospel, where no matter where you are, what culture you're in, what time you're in, whatever, it applies and it's right. It's always the right thing, you know, because it's not a system of man. It's from God.
That goes back to our last episode about ethics and morality as a whole.
Yeah.
It is from God. And for the thing about, you know, the tearing down the status quo, you know, I would ask somebody, what would that society look like? You know, envisioning that, you know, what would society look like, you say, you know, without whatever trappings that they think should be gone? You know, what does that look like? How does it function and flow? And of course, I think people always kind of want to look for the idealistic side of it. But if you look, where there is no fundamental nuclear family anymore.
Right.
You know, you don't have distinct gender roles and assignments. You don't have any of those things. You don't have any kind of rule of law governing those things. What would that society look like? You know, I think people just say, "Oh, everybody would just be happy."
Right.
No, but what does it look like? You know, and it doesn't look happy because you can't even find it in the earth. If it was this utopian sort of experiment, where does it exist on earth?
Right.
Every single society that's ever had any sort of success at all and anywhere, it has started with families. And when that breaks down, generally speaking, the society breaks down.
Problems. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I think one of the great ironies too is, you know, from my perspective, you can't have utopia on earth, obviously, because sin. But the closest thing you have to utopia is actually the church, I would argue.
Absolutely.
Like faithful Christians together. That's the closest thing you have to utopia. But that's the thing. Many people think you have to get rid of in order to usher in utopia. So, I mean, it's like you're shooting yourself in the foot to begin with.
Yeah.
You know?
And it is true. And what Forrest said a while back about the Bible Christianity, that's considered as oppressive. And it is true that through the ages, like people would justify slavery, for example, on Scripture. And so the Bible has been abused throughout the ages, but it's not the cause of every wrongdoing and all that on the earth. Sin is. Right. But the people that take this view that the status quo is oppressive, you know, since Christianity and the Bible, after all, our country was founded on Christianity, they say, and so forth, because the Bible and Christianity has been part of our society, and our society is oppressive. Therefore, the Bible and Christianity got to go.
Right.
And so that's where this, you know, the rubber hits the road on this. But as Christians, of course, we know that there is no, you know, utopian society here. And what Forrest said about the church is awesome. That's true. And that's, come to think of it, I can be bummed out, but when I come to church services, I'm renewed and fired up again because I'm with my brothers and sisters. So I guess that is the closest thing to utopia on this earth.
But you know, just as an aside to that, even if you aren't lifted up immediately, even if you come to worship and you do your best to worship God, but your circumstances are such that you are still low when you leave, that is still a far better existence than without it.
Right.
Because at least there's still hope of that next day. There is still the fellowship of people who have a like mind and thinking toward godliness, have your best interest in mind, who view you with value because God made you with value, all those things. So even if you aren't pumped up when you walk out the door, but I think most people would be uplifted in some way, but even if you aren't, it still far exceeds the opposite.
Yes, very good point. And of course, as Christians, we're taught to expect persecution anyway. And so, I mean, you know, 2 Timothy 3:12, 1 Peter 4:16, and of course, Jesus said, you know, in the world you're going to have tribulation, John 16:33, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. And so we can't expect a utopia upon this earth. And so the gospel does answer that about the status quo being oppressive. Even if it was, we can still live Christian lives and practice Christianity. All right, the second lie in disguise, not only status quo is impressive, and this is a big one here, and I'm going to have a lot of quotes on this, but self-expressed individualism is necessary for your worth and identity. Let me say that again. Quote, self-expressed individualism is necessary for your worth and identity. Now, a quote here from Carl Trueman in his book's Strange New World on page 22. He says, the modern self assumes the authority of inner feelings and sees authenticity as defined by the ability to give social expression to the same. That is, inner feelings and inner feelings there. And now, when I first heard the term authenticity several years ago, well, I don't know, a couple of years ago, in this kind of a context, what they mean by authenticity is not what you and I mean by authenticity at first glance. We mean by it genuineness, that kind of thing.
Right.
But in their view, authenticity is going against the status quo to express inner feelings and identity, going against the status quo. Mm-hmm. And, of course, this will come out in CRT a little bit, but that's why, like if, a person with dark skin criticizes other people with dark skin that are in the CRT movement, for example, they are ostracized. They are, because if you're going to criticize, they're going against the status quo. You're not being authentic. You are just trying to fit into the status quo. And the same could be said about, I know when, the president was elected just now, I mean, there were people on his side from the gay rights movement. But the mainstream gay rights would reject them because they are saying, it's okay and all that stuff. But you're, in other words, you can't be authentic unless you're going against the status quo.
Right.
And so that authenticity took on a whole new meaning. And when the public hears that, authenticity this, authenticity that, they're thinking of genuineness. Mm-hmm. In fact, what really got me to really open my eyes on it is I heard a preacher, a very, very popular preacher, and at the time he was beginning a lot of his sermons about, outsiders want to see authentic Christians, authenticity this and authenticity that. That's what attracts the younger people and all that.
Yeah.
And my first response was, I might be 60 years old, but I was no slouch when I obeyed the gospel.
Right.
I was looking for that too.
Yeah.
What I thought was authenticity. Mm-hmm. But then when I learned some more things, I look back on that, it's like, no, that's not the authenticity these people are talking about.
Yeah.
The authenticity they're talking about is going against what they consider the status quo. You're not authentic unless you're going against all that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then, of course, like that great irony is by being authentic, you're actually being fake, for lack of a better term.
That's
right.
Yes.
Because you say, well, let's say I'm a man, but I say my authentic self is a woman. That's the opposite of my authentic self, right? No matter what my inner thoughts and feelings are, if I think I'm a woman, that doesn't mean I'm authentically a woman. I'm authentically a man. Like, that's what reality is, right? But if I say, well, my inner thoughts and feelings override that, and like what this is saying, unless I'm able to socially display that, then I can't really be me. No, the you that is legit is you're a dude, right? But for whatever reason, authenticity is the bravery to say, to buck against the status quo. But sometimes the status quo is like objective reality or nature or whatever,
But that seems like that would be alarming, though. If I'm not authentic unless I can manifest it and demonstrate it socially, where everybody else can kind of see it and pat me on the back for it.
Right.
Why? What if I were on a mountainside all by myself? Can I be authentic there, or do I have to have the audience to concur with me and say, "Okay, all right, now you're authentic because now you fit into our status quo, but not that status quo that we're kind of going against." It seems to be just disingenuous, I guess is the best way I say it.
Yeah, for sure.
And here's another quote, and this is by Robert Bella in his book Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Contentment in American Life on page 333 to 334. He says, expressive individualism holds that each person has a unique core of feelings and intuition that should unfold or be expressed if individuality is to be realized, which there's a certain part of that that's true. Another quote by Carl Trueman, page 25, if a person's inner identity is defined by sexual desire, then he or she must be allowed to act out on that desire in order to be an authentic person. And when you see, and this several years ago, well, it was before COVID. We were just talking about that, but we seem to relate time before COVID. But anyway, we put a sign on our marquee, LGBT means let God be true, which would have been pretty cool, except I did put Romans 1, 26 and 27 during June, which around here is Gay Pride Month, you know. And she called herself a youth minister, but I saw her pictures on Facebook, and man, she, you know, I don't know, dressed like a cartoon character, I guess, to be polite about it, just, you know, cussing all over her Facebook and all kinds of stuff. And I just thought, wow. But then several years ago is when I came across this quote, you know, if your inner identity is defined by sexual desire, then he or she must be allowed to act out that desire in order to be an authentic person.
Yeah.
And so no wonder we have all these, the people like they are wanting to be, because that's their inner desire.
Right.
And unless you act that out, you're not authentic.
Yeah. And then the church or Christianity is viewed as oppressive because it won't let you be who you really are.
Yes.
You know, and who I really am isn't, you know, God's standard for me or how God made me. Who I really am is who I want to be or what makes me feel good.
Inner feeling.
Yeah. And unless you let me do that, you're oppressing me because I can't be my true self.
That's interesting. Is that I don't know, it makes me have a lot of questions in a lot of different areas because what you do and who you are vastly different. You know, not everybody is who they are because of the job you have.
Right.
You know, what if I'm a garbage man? Does that mean I'm a garbage person? And that's the only thing I can do? I could be a garbage man and a philosopher by night.
Right.
Or a fisherman or, you know, whatever job. Does my job dictate who I am? Or is it just those base carnal sort of feelings that, you know, I want to, and usually when it's kind of in this sort of a thing about self-expression and those sorts of things, it usually has some sort of base carnal drive behind it. Yeah. I want to do drugs. I want to have, you know, sex with as many people without, I'll just say, I want to have unfettered sexual freedom and those sorts of things. So it's just always, I want to resort to this kind of a carnal based sort of a desire for myself. It's not lifting myself higher. It's not rising to a greater morality. And usually when you hear this stuff, it's never, you know, I want to be expressive of, you know, by helping out the old people in my neighborhood.
Right. Loving my neighbor.
Loving my neighbor. I want to go and help the homeless, you know. Though there are people who are in those groups that do those things. I don't want to make it seem like every person who's in those categories, they're just, you know, like demons walking around the earth. However, it seems like the primary motivation is always some sort of, I don't want God's rules to apply to me, because I don't think that people would say throw the Bible out in its entirety. I believe that most of the people would say there are good things in the Bible. You know, sharing, you know, treat people like you want to be treated, you know, the golden rule, except for when it's restrictive for their little activities that they want to engage in.
Right. And I think this idea that your inner feelings couldn't be wrong.
Exactly.
That's the crazy thing to me, where it's like, okay, if I challenge your, like you said, base desires or sexual fantasies even, or whatever, that you turn into your identity, all of a sudden I'm the bad person or God's the bad person, right? Where I think that's where you see the part of the requirement of humility is recognizing that just because I have a feeling or a thought or a desire does not make those things right. I could be wrong. I could be off base. I could be misguided.
Absolutely. And
I need God. You know, my authentic self isn't found in me living however I want. My authentic self is found in obeying God. That's why I'm here. Right? That's the whole duty of man, to fear God and keep his commandments. Not to express yourself sexually, not to live out whatever gender you think you might be, regardless of what your physical identity is. We're here to serve God. We're made in his image and likeness. So, you know, that's where authenticity comes from. It doesn't come from me doing whatever I want. Anybody could do that. I mean, that's animals do that, right?
Right.
This is, what if I'm called to something higher and I've got to crucify myself and take up my cross and I've got to deny myself and I've got to, and God gives me all those things that are worth living for, worth dying for.
But that's the core of the issue is that, and you said it just a second ago, that individuals define themselves by those base desires.
Right.
And so my desires, it's like my true self is not defined by my desires. So just because I want to do something, that's not who I am.
Right.
It should be the exact opposite, that who I am should form my desires.
Right.
And so if I realize who I am, well, I'm a being that's been made in the image of a self-existent creator God.
Right.
Well, then I need to shape my desires to be in line with that self-existing creator God. And it shouldn't be, well, I want to be a sexual deviant. Well, then that's just who I am.
Yeah.
And so now I'm going to shape a personality and a reality based on deviancy.
Right.
It should be the exact opposite. And that's kind of where, I think we've just run amok.
For sure. And I think that's where, I know we'll probably get to this later, but I think that's where, people in our government are trying to use the same laws used to protect the citizens of Black Americans to extend those to folks in the LGBTQ plus camp. And what they're saying is, like, Stephen, you being Black is as much a part of you as this person being gay.
Oh, that's exactly
right. And they can't help it. And if we don't acknowledge that and give them their quote unquote rights, then we're denying their humanity. So you're equating something like race with something like sexual preference, gender identity, etc.
Which is to me the highest of insults.
I was going to say, it should be
the color
offensive.
of my skin has nothing to do with my behavior.
Right.
Nothing at all.
Right.
You and I have different color skin, but I would say there's probably a lot of overlap in what we do in life.
Right.
And what we desire to be able to do and accomplish in life.
Right.
Has nothing to do with anything.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with. But for people to say that, man, I heard the person say that, and it was a person that had the same color skin that I have, and I'm like, man, how could you, come with that sort of a mindset to say, well, I want to do this behavior, and that's just the exact same thing of, being Black.
Right. Yeah. Where, like you said, a behavior becomes my identity.
That's exactly what it is. A behavior becomes your identity.
Yeah.
And that's wrong with anything. It doesn't matter what it is. A behavior of any kind should not become my identity, because then I have a false sense of who I am.
Right.
And what if I want to change my behavior? Well, then I have to change my identity along there, and it's not that way.
Exactly. And I think that's some of the sticking point with trying to reach out to people in the LGBTQ communities to repent is they feel like you're asking me to change who I am.
Exactly. Exactly.
And even then, to a degree, yes, right? I had to change who I am to a degree, right? Because you have to be born again. You have to be born a second time. And you have to be remade in the image of your creator, where there's, habits, desires, et cetera, that we all had that we have to crucify when we come to Christ. And nobody's exempt from that.
Yeah, and behavior is always choice. We have to choose behavior, skin color of your eyes and all that. That's not in the same category. We have no choice about that.
Right.
And, of course, sometimes we can do something over and over again that becomes like second nature. And I think that's the meaning there, that you were by nature the children of wrath in Ephesians chapter 2, just you do over and over again. And we can, sear our conscience over it where we think that's right. But somewhere along the way we didn't behave that way, and then we did, and it was a choice, unlike skin color or anything like that.
Yeah.
And here's a couple other quotes that kind of go right along with this. This one here is from Charles Taylor again. The culture of authenticity is one where each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity. And that's true to a certain extent. And that it is important to find and live out one's own as against surrendering to conformity, which I'm going to insert here, which is the status quo, uninserted, back to the quote, with a model imposed on us from outside. In other words, we must not surrender to conformity with the model imposed on us from outside by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority. And so, in other words, all these things were contributing, end quote back there, but all these things were contributing to the oppressive society. And then this quote kind of brings together what we've just been saying. The modern self is one where authenticity is achieved by acting outwardly in accordance with one's inward feelings.
Lord have mercy.
And this is why, questioning or criticizing someone's lifestyle choice, quote unquote, is rejected, or even some people try to make it illegal, because it's seen as denying that person's or maybe the community's right of individuality or personhood or authenticity. In other words, you have to let that person express his or her inward feelings, or else, and Forrest had mentioned this, you're denying his humanness, his personality, which is kind of ridiculous.
Well, even beyond, it's not just you have to express your feelings. You're allowed to act them out.
Yes.
And that's the thing that's really, you could admit, hey, I want to do this, or I have this feeling, whatever. But to say, you have to let me act it out, that's where we get into chaos.
And I know that this should go without saying, but I want to maybe presumptuously speak for you guys, but I want it to be stated that we are not in any wise saying that people should not have civil rights. So if you're a person that belongs to any letter group or what have you, we're not saying that you should not have the right to safety, that you shouldn't have the right to be able to go and have food and drink in a safe place to live and vote.
Like that, yeah.
We're not saying that you shouldn't have the right to drive and earn a living and all that kind of stuff, have peace without being assaulted and all that. That's not the case. However, it's going far beyond that. People don't want rights anymore. They want to impose themselves on us. And so no matter what it is, people say, well, I don't want you to just let me be. I want you to let me be where steps on your toes, and I want you to let me encroach upon what you're doing, and I want to get to your children, and I want to impact the way you have to speak to me. I want to impact your words. Your words can't, it's like, well, wait a minute, why can't you do conforming? And so that goes back to tearing down the status quo. I want to tear down even the status quo of language and identity as a whole. Let's tear all that down, and you have to call me anything I want and you have to do it.
Right.
It's like, man, it really just erodes. It goes back to like the quote that you had in the very, very, very beginning, the opening quote from the Alice in Wonderland, which I don't guess I've ever seen Alice in Wonderland at all. So now I need to go back and watch it. I don't know if it's in the Disney Vault or not, but I got to go back and watch it. But yeah, it does get to a point where everything becomes relative and becomes nonsensical.
Right.
Because if I can make my reality whatever I want it to, then I can rechange it minute by minute, and you have to acknowledge it. And if your reality can be changed minute by minute, well, what then is real?
Right. And I think it takes things that are virtues and makes them not good, right? So if I have to live out my authentic self by, outwardly acting out my inner feelings, conformity is a virtue. In fact, God's goal for us is to conform to the image of his Son. And that requires me to have some inward feelings that I don't act out. That requires me to have some desires that I wrestle with and conquer. That, requires me to fight things like temptation, etc. And this way of thinking throws all that out the window, right? If something crosses through your mind, do it. If a feeling comes up, pursue it. All those different things where it's like, wait a second. I think it also goes back to how you view human nature, where we understand that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God, and there's not a man on earth who always does righteous and never sins. But as opposed to, hey, we're just animals, whatever thought you have, pursue it.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous idea.
Okay, and so this is, and Stephen mentioned this earlier about, where do we find our worth and identity? It's not through, quote, authenticity, going against the status quo. It's not by our inner feelings, but as Stephen mentioned, and even more importantly, the Bible talks about we are made in God's image. And so every single human being is worth more than the whole world and all its resources. And just by virtue of the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God, also our mind is to be renewed. So if our inner feelings, which are based upon our thinking, if our inner feelings are not renewed, if they're not in line with God's system of ethics, like we talked about last episode, but if our inner feelings are not in line with that, if our worth is not in line with that, we need to renew our minds through the Word of God and have the mind of Christ in us, as Philippians 2:5 states, Romans 12:2 about renewing your mind. And then we realize that God knows us. God knows us. He knows, even though, and I've often thought about this in the book of Revelation, we have, I think it's chapter 2:13, talks about a guy by the name of Antipas, my faithful martyr, he calls him. Now, we would not know a thing about him except for the Bible mentions him by name. But think of how many other people the Bible doesn't mention, but God knows. The time would fail me to tell of, he goes on to mention some, but, so God knows what we go through. He knows, and because of that, we are of extreme value. Those 7 letters written to the churches in Asia in Revelation 2 and 3, every single one of those, I know your works. I know. And so that's where our value comes. That's where identity comes in being made in the image and likeness of God. And as Christians, of course, we have the identity of Christ. Your life is hid. Colossians 3 verse 4 or Colossians 3:3. Yeah, hidden in him.
Yeah, and I think, that really... Well, I think there's a lot of people who say that it's impossible not to live out, these desires or these feelings that they have, but God gives us a way to do it. He'll help us, to live our true authentic self, which is in obedience to Him and service to Him. God gives us the grace and the strength we need, especially in Christ Jesus, to be able to take up our cross and deny ourselves and to really, true authenticity, which is genuineness and doing God's will. God will help us do that. I think a lot of people feel like they're stuck and they have to do their feelings and their desires and their thoughts, and they have to live that way. And that's the best way to live. And sometimes they admit it, sometimes they don't. Down the road, eventually, you're miserable. You're absolutely miserable because that's not the way God designed us to live. God designed us for so much more and to walk in what He's given to us in His Word.
That's what is we have to look at who we are, man, and not what we do. If what we do defines us, then we're going to be all messed up. It has to be what and who I am. And I am a being created by God. Because if it's only by my actions, then I'm going to stay messed up.
Yeah.
I'll stay confused.
Well, that's because you're not a thing, right? That's how we define things. Like a mailbox. What's a mailbox? It holds mail. You know what I mean? Because that's all it is. Like, there's nothing that transcends. But so if you just whittle yourself down to the things you do, it's like you're a widget or like a gear in a gearbox or something.
Tool
or, like you're just like a cog. What does a cog do? Goes into the gear. Okay, we're more than that. We're not just these physical things. We've got a spirit and a soul.
Okay, we are running out of time for this episode, so we're going to save the third point, which is going to be sexual relationships are inconsequential as a lie disguised. But I want to close out this now this guy used to be a faithful preacher a long time ago, good preacher. Then he became one of the biggest change agents in the late 80s and 90s and all that. But he recently wrote a book about gender and about this transgender stuff. From what I hear, it's a really good book. I just heard someone talk about it. But he does have this quote in there that I think is very applicable to this. And he said something like, I don't want to be authentic. I want to be Christ-like. So however we define authenticity, and in this particular case, it's going against the status quo in this context here, but however we define it, should not that be our goal, that I want to be Christ-like?
Amen.
And I think that's what we reach for.
Yeah,
that's it.
Well, we appreciate your being with us today, and we invite you to come back at our next episode where we'll finish this out, these lies in disguise. Please join us and check out the FSOP website, fsop.net.
Salvation has been brought down, oh glory, praise the Lord.